Chapter 1, Mishnah 2. The blood, the amurin, the parts of the animal that are burned on the Mizbeach, or meat of a korban that leaves its proper place can become invalidated as yotze, literally going out. The blood and amurin are invalidated as yotze if they are removed from the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. The invalidation of the meat of the korban, however, depends on the type of korban. Meat of kodshe kodashim must be eaten in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash and becomes invalid if removed. Meat of Kodashim Kalim, on the other hand, may be eaten anywhere within the walls of Jerusalem, and is not invalidated unless it is taken out of the city. Once the meat of a korban is invalidated, as Yotze, it may no longer be eaten, even if it is brought back to its proper place. See Pesachim 82a and b. The previous Mishnah stated that if a disqualification, such as Yotze, occurred after Zerika, the korban is not subject to the laws of Me'ilah. The reason for this is that once the meat becomes permitted to the Kohanim through Zerika, it is no longer subject to Me'ilah. This Mishnah discusses the law of meat of Kodshe Kodashim that left the courtyard before Zerika. We now turn to the words of the Mishnah. Regarding Mishnah of Kodshe Kodashim that left the courtyard before Zerika, thereby becoming invalidated as Yotze, and then after the meat was brought back inside, Zerika was performed, Rabbi Eliezer says the meat is still subject to Me'ilah. Since the meat was previously disqualified when it left the courtyard, Zerika does not permit it to be eaten by Kohanim. Therefore, it never had a time when it was permitted for the Kohanim, and it remains subject to Me'ilah, see previous Mishnah. And a person will not be liable to kares for the transgression of pigul nosar tameh with this meat in a situation where those prohibitions would normally apply. Rabbi Akiva, however, says meat of kodshe kodashim that left the courtyard before Zerika is not subject to Me'ilah after it was brought back in and the blood was thrown. According to Rabbi Akiva, Zerika removes Me'ilah, despite the fact that the meat was disqualified when it left the courtyard. And indeed, since it is considered a valid Zerika, if a person eats this meat that left the courtyard and then was brought back in, he will be liable to kares for the transgression of pigul, nosar, or tameh with this meat, if any of those situations apply. Rabbi Akiva brings proof that the meat of kodshe kodashim that left the courtyard before Zerika is no longer subject to Me'ilah after Zerika was performed, despite the fact that it became invalid as yotze and cannot be eaten by the Kohanim. Rabbi Akiva said, consider the case of a person who designated his animal to be brought as a chatas, and then it was lost, and he then designated another animal for a chatas in its place. And afterward, the first one was found, and after they were both slaughtered, and their blood was received in separate vessels that are both now standing ready for the blood of one of them to be thrown on the Mizbeach. In such a case, is it not true that just as throwing the blood of one chatas exempts its own meat from being subject to Me'ilah, as is the law for the meat of all kodshe kodashim after Zerika, so too it exempts the meat of its companion, i.e. the other chatas, from being subject to Me'ilah? Indeed, this is the rule. Now, if Zerika of the blood of one chatas exempts even the meat of its companion from Me'ilah, as it does in the case of the chatas that was lost, even though the meat of the other chatas is now disqualified and may not be eaten by the Kohanim, then it certainly follows that Zerika of its own blood should exempt its meat from Me'ilah, even though that meat has been disqualified by leaving the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. That is, if in the case of the two animals, where the meat of the second one becomes disqualified after the Zerika of the first, and thus was never permissible for the Kohanim, we say that nevertheless its meat becomes exempt from Me'ilah, then certainly the Zerika done for a single animal should be effective to exempt its own meat from Me'ilah, even though its meat cannot be eaten, as in our Mishnah's case, where the meat left the courtyard.